I'm not the kind of guy who thinks he's irreplaceable. I'm the kind of guy who updates the run book at 11:30 p.m. because nobody else will, and then shows up the next morning like it never happened. So when people say things like, "You run that whole account," I usually shrug it off. In corporate America, "you run it" just means you answer your phone more than everyone else. But this contract was different. Not because it was glamorous. Not because it was fun. It was the opposite. Heavy, messy, and always one bad change away from a client meltdown. Tri-state health network. Multiple hospitals. Emergency rooms. Scheduling systems. Patient records flowing through integrations that were older than some of our junior engineers. The contract was $18.6 million over 3 years, and it had the kind of SLA language that makes executives sound confident in sales calls and makes delivery teams quietly lose sleep. Severity 1 downtime had a grace window. Then it turned into penalties. $50,000 per hour until services were restored. And buried in the legal scaffolding was the part most people never read. A key personnel clause. The client didn't want a team. They wanted a name. One accountable human being they could drag into a bridge call at 3 a.m. and demand answers from. My name. I didn't lobby for it. I didn't ask for it. In fact, I tried to avoid it, because I knew exactly what it meant. If something went wrong, the spotlight wouldn't land on the vendor. It would land on me. I was the service delivery lead on paper, which made me the person who owned the escalation tree, the incident cadence, the weekly operational deck, and the ugly truth that most companies try to hide. When the system is down, nobody cares what your org chart says. They care who can fix it. That's why I kept my personal phone in the contract file, not my office number, not some shared line. My cell, I was the safety latch, which is why the morning they terminated me felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain at first. It happened on a Tuesday, the week between Christmas and New Year's, the dead week when executives clean up headcount, because half the company is on PTO and nobody asks questions. I was in my kitchen, coffee barely touched, scrolling through my calendar for the day. Nothing special. A weekly ops review at 10, a change advisory review at 2, a short risk call with our internal security team at 4. Then my work laptop chimed. Subject line, separation notice, effective immediately. No warning, no meeting invite, no manager call, just an email. I opened it and stared at the first sentence like my brain refused to translate it. Your employment with Arkvale Solutions is terminated, effective immediately. My throat went dry, not because I loved my job, but because of what it implied. This wasn't a performance plan. This wasn't, we're restructuring. This was a clean cut. I looked down at the timestamp. 7:42 a.m. My phone buzzed once, then again. Not texts, system notifications. I glanced up at my laptop screen, and in the top corner, the VPN icon flickered, then disappeared. Slack went gray. Outlook froze like it was holding its breath. I clicked my password manager out of instinct, and it rejected me like I'd never existed. I walked to my front window, still holding my phone, and my brain did something weird. It started listing dependencies like it was trying to find the one thing that mattered most. My badge access, my admin tokens, the incident management tool, the vendor portal logins, the Bridgeline host rights. Not because I wanted power, because I knew what effective immediately does in a live environment. It breaks continuity. And there are environments where continuity isn't a nice to have, it's oxygen. I should have called my manager. That's what most people do. They call to argue, to plead, to ask for a reason. But I'd been around long enough to know you don't win that call. Instead, I forwarded the termination email to my personal account. Then I took screenshots. Every line, every timestamp, every footer. I wasn't thinking lawsuit. I was thinking something simpler. If this turns into a blame game, I'm not going to be the easy target. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email, not a notification. Not from Arkvale, from Tri-State, to my personal inbox. The subject line made my stomach drop like I missed a step on stairs. SEV1 Bridge. Immediate attendance required. I opened it. There was an incident bridge link, a call-in number, and a line that was so blunt it didn't feel real. Primary contact, Ethan Cole, named service delivery lead. I stared at my own name like it belonged to someone else, and then my phone rang. Unknown number, probably the bridge operator. I didn't answer. Not because I was being petty. Because I'd just been terminated. My access was cut. My tools were gone. I couldn't even authenticate into the incident platform to view logs. If I joined that bridge call, I would be doing live production work as a non-employee, with no coverage, no authority, and no record inside the company. And if anything went sideways, the story would be simple. Ethan was on the call. I let it ring out. Then another email came in from the same thread. This one tagged high importance. Ethan, confirm you're on. We have hospitals scheduling outages across 3 sites. That's when I felt the first flicker of something that wasn't fear. Anger, quiet, controlled, the kind that sharpens you. Because I understood what had happened before anyone said it out loud. They didn't just terminate an employee. They terminated the person the contract recognized as responsible, while the contract was actively on fire. I opened my notes app and wrote one sentence just to steady my thinking. If they're cutting me off at 7:43, they don't get to use me at 7:44. Then I pulled up the contract file I'd saved months ago. Because I'm the kind of person who reads what I sign, it took me less than a minute to find the clause. Key personnel. Replacement requires client approval. Failure to maintain key personnel triggers a cure period. My hands stopped shaking. Not because I felt safe, because I finally knew what the day was really going to be about. And at 8:17 a.m., a new message hit my inbox from the client's governance lead. One sentence, no greeting, no fluff. Confirm Ethan Cole is still the named lead on this contract. I didn't reply to the client right away, not because I didn't care, because I cared too much to answer emotionally. I sat at my kitchen table and read that one sentence again. Confirm Ethan Cole is still the named lead on this contract. It wasn't a casual question. It was the kind of line that gets copied into a formal notice later. And I could already picture the internal conversation at Arkvale, my company, happening without me. Sales would say, we'll smooth it over. Delivery would say, we just need him on the bridge for 10 minutes. Legal would say, why is the client emailing his personal address? Meanwhile, I was staring at my dead laptop like it was a crime scene. I did the only thing that made sense. I started documenting in real time. I opened a new note and wrote down 3 columns. Time, event, proof. 7:42, termination email received, screenshot. Plus forwarded copy, 7:43. Access revoked, VPN, Slack, email. Screenshots, 7.55. Client SEV1 bridge. Invite to personal email. Saved email, 8.17. Client asks if I'm still named lead. Saved email. Then I waited. Because when someone cuts you off effective immediately, and then tries to pull you back into the work, the first person to speak usually loses. My phone rang again. Same unknown number. I watched it ring out. 10 seconds later, a text came in from my manager, Greg. Not a call, not a meeting. A text. Hey, need you to jump on a quick client bridge, 10 mins. No mention of the termination. Like we were still on casual Tuesday terms. I stared at it until the anger tightened in my chest. If he'd written, I'm sorry, maybe I would have softened. If he'd written, I didn't know, maybe I would have believed him. But 10 mins told me everything. They wanted the outcome, without the responsibility. They wanted me to hold the wheel while they pretended I wasn't in the car. I typed back one sentence. Put the request in writing, from HR or legal. My employment was terminated at 7:42. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then Greg called. I didn't answer. That wasn't pettiness. That was strategy. Calls vanish into the air. Emails don't. A minute later, another text came through. Shorter this time. Don't make this hard. I actually laughed once quietly. Because it was already hard. They made it hard when they pushed a button and erased my access. I stood up and walked to the counter, like motion would keep me from spiraling. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email to my personal address, from an Arkvale HR coordinator I barely knew. Subject: urgent, client escalation. I opened it and felt my jaw lock. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an acknowledgement of what they'd done. It was a request, dressed like an instruction. Ethan, due to immediate operational needs, we are requesting your participation on an emergency bridge call. Please join as soon as possible. No mention of pay, no mention of status, no mention of coverage. Just join. I forwarded it to myself again. Then I replied. One of the coldest, cleanest emails I've ever written. I received notice of termination effective immediately at 7:42 a.m. My access has been revoked. I am not authorized to perform work or represent Arkvale Solutions. Please advise, in writing, who is the authorized contract representative for Tri-State Health Network as of this moment. I hit send, then immediately took a screenshot, and then the silence started. Not total silence, more like a sudden change in pressure, because they were expecting me to fold. What they got was a paper trail. My phone rang again, but this time the caller ID wasn't unknown. Tri-State Governance. I stared at it. If I didn't answer, they'd assume I was avoiding them. If I did answer, they'd pull me into just help us. And suddenly I'm working for free, unofficially with no protection. So I met it in the only safe way. I didn't answer the call. I replied to the client's email instead. Short, factual, respectful. I can confirm I received notice this morning that my employment with Arkvale Solutions has been terminated effective immediately, and my access has been revoked. I am not currently authorized to act on Arkvale's behalf. Please route operational requests to Arkvale's designated contract owner and legal notice address. I didn't add emotion. I didn't add blame. Just reality. 2 minutes later, a new email thread appeared, and my stomach dropped when I saw who was CC'd. Arkvale Legal. Arkvale VP of Delivery. Someone from Tri-State Procurement. Someone from Tri-State Risk. That wasn't a bridge call anymore. That was governance. That was accountability. That was the part executives try to avoid until they can't. And right under my message, the Tri-State Governance Lead replied with another line that felt like a door slamming shut. Understood. Please provide the effective timestamp in any written notice you received. I attached the termination email. I attached the screenshot showing the timestamp. I attached the HR request telling me to join the bridge after I'd been terminated. Then I hit send. And for the first time that morning, I felt something that wasn't panic. Relief. Because now the truth wasn't just in my head. It was in the client's inbox. I was standing in my kitchen, still in sweatpants, when my phone buzzed again, this time with a Slack notification, which was impossible because my Slack was locked out. I tapped it and it asked me to log in. I tried. It rejected me. But the fact that it even pinged meant someone inside Arkvale had tried to re-enable something, like they were scrambling, like they'd realized what they'd just done. Then Greg texted again, different tone now. We can get you paid for today. Just please join. That's when it clicked. They weren't panicking because the system was down. Systems go down. Companies survive. They were panicking because the client now had proof, in writing, that Arkvale had terminated the named responsible person during an active SCV1. And that wasn't just messy. That was contractual. That was reportable. That was the kind of thing that makes procurement stop payments and makes legal start asking, who approved this? I stared at Greg's message for a long time before replying. Then I wrote one sentence. Send a written agreement from legal, rate, scope, and indemnity. Otherwise, I'm not authorized. I hit send. And for the next 5 minutes, nothing. No threats, no demands. Just a sudden heavy quiet. The kind of quiet that tells you someone finally read the clause you've been warning them about for months. And I didn't know it yet. But in that moment, Arkvale started building a second story. Not for the client, for themselves. A story where they didn't fire me, where I refused to cooperate, where I abandoned my job. Because if they could sell that story internally, they could make me the villain and maybe avoid admitting the truth. They had cut the only person responsible for a live contract while the penalties were running, and the client was already watching. The weird thing about corporate panic is that it never sounds like panic. It sounds like quick sync and just a line and we'll circle back. But when you've been on the other side of enough outages, you learn to recognize the moment a room full of adults realizes they can't talk their way out of physics. At 9:06 a.m., Tri-State's governance lead replied to the thread I'd started, now with more people CC'd than any email should ever have. Procurement, risk, legal, a director with compliance in her title. And two names I didn't recognize, which usually meant one thing: outside counsel or an internal escalation chain. She wrote, "Noted. We are requesting confirmation of Arkvale's designated key personnel replacement and written transition plan by end of day." End of day. Not when convenient. Not next week. Because in their world, end of day is what you say when you're deciding whether to pause payments or issue a cure notice. I took a screenshot and added it to my notes. 9:06. Client requests. Replacement. Plus transition plan. EOD. Saved email. Then I did something I didn't want to do. I called an employment attorney, not because I was itching to sue, not because I wanted revenge, because I could feel the direction this was going. If Arkvale couldn't stabilize the contract, someone would try to stabilize the narrative. And narratives are where employees get crushed. The receptionist asked for a summary. I gave her the short version. I was terminated this morning. My access was immediately revoked. The client contacted me directly because my name is in the contract as key personnel. My employer is asking me to work anyway. She didn't sound surprised. She asked one question that made me sit up straighter. "Do you have it in writing?" "Yes." "Save everything." So I did. While I waited for the attorney to call back, my phone lit up with messages from people I hadn't talked to in months. A former coworker, a project manager, someone from the on-call rotation. It wasn't gossip. It was something else. Curiosity mixed with fear. Because when a live contract is on fire, the people closest to it start looking around for the nearest exit. One message stood out. It was from Maya, an operations analyst who'd been on my team last year before she transferred internally. "Ethan, they're saying you refused to join the bridge. They're telling people you walked out." There it was, the second story. I didn't respond emotionally. I didn't send a paragraph. I asked one question. "Who said that?" She replied almost immediately. "Greg, and VP Delivery is backing him." I stared at my phone until my hands started to ache. It wasn't just Greg freelancing. It was coordinated, which meant someone higher up had decided the safest version of the truth was the one where I was the problem. That's when the anger in my chest shifted into something calmer and colder. If they were going to paint me as job abandonment, I needed to make it impossible. I opened my email and sent one message to Arkvale HR and Legal. Same thread, same recipients. Not long, not dramatic. Just a clean statement with dates and times. To be clear, I received written notice at 7:42 a.m. that my employment was terminated effective immediately. My access was revoked at approximately 7:43 a.m. Any operational request following termination must be routed through a written agreement defining scope, compensation, and liability coverage. Absent that, I am not authorized to perform work or represent Arkvale. Then I attached the termination notice again, because repetition is annoying unless you're building evidence. 10 minutes later, my attorney called. He didn't waste time. He asked me to forward everything: termination email, HR request, texts, client thread. I did. And then he said the sentence that hit hardest. They're trying to force you into performing work without employment coverage. And if anything goes wrong, they'll say you acted independently. I looked down at the SEV1 bridge invite sitting in my inbox like a live grenade. I knew he was right, but there was still a part of me that felt sick about it, because Tri-State wasn't just a logo to me. It was real people, real hospitals, real consequences. That was the hook Arkvale was trying to use on me, my sense of responsibility. They were banking on me being the guy who always says yes. So I made a decision that felt like swallowing glass. I sent one more email to Tri-State, and I kept it purely factual. No blame, no emotion, no drama. I understand the urgency. I am no longer employed by Arkvale, and my access has been revoked. I cannot join internal bridges or access systems. For contractual governance, please use the legal notice address and the escalation contacts listed in the MSA. If Arkvale proposes a temporary consulting arrangement, it must be initiated in writing by Arkvale Legal. Then I stopped. I didn't refresh. I didn't hover over my phone. I forced myself to breathe like a normal person, because the truth was the most dangerous thing I could do was help informally. That's how they trap you. That's how you end up being responsible for something you no longer control. Around 11:30 a.m., Maya called me. Actual call, not text. I answered because I trusted her. Her voice was low, like she was hiding in a stairwell. "They're scrambling," she said. "The client is asking who signed off on your termination. They can't answer. They're trying to get someone else named, but Tri-State won't approve it without a transition plan." I didn't feel triumphant. I felt numb, because this wasn't a chess game to me. It was my life, my name, my reputation. "And the outage?" I asked. "It's not fully resolved," she said carefully. "They stabilized one site, but 2 hospitals are still in degraded mode, and the penalties are adding up." I looked at my notes again. $50,000 per hour, even if only part of the services were down. Tri-State's contract had language that let them classify the incident as CV1 based on patient impact, not just technical metrics. Arkvale leadership was staring at a meter that was spinning, and I suddenly realized something else. This wasn't only about the outage. Tri-State had been quietly pushing for better staffing for months. They'd asked for redundancy. They'd asked for a deputy lead. I'd escalated those requests internally more than once. Arkvale kept delaying, kept optimizing, kept pretending the risk didn't exist, as long as the dashboards were green. Until the day they terminated the one person whose name was on the clause that prevented them from pretending. And in that moment, I understood exactly what Arkvale was trying to do with their second story. They weren't just avoiding embarrassment. They were trying to avoid liability. If they could claim I abandoned the account, then it wasn't their decision that violated key personnel. It was my behavior, my refusal, my unprofessionalism. And the thing about corporate blame is, it doesn't need to be true. It just needs to be repeated long enough inside the building. That night, I stopped being the hero, not because I stopped caring about the hospitals, because I realized Arkvale wasn't asking me to help Tri-State. They were asking me to protect Arkvale from what Arkvale had done. And once I saw that clearly, I knew there was only one move left. I had to make sure the client, legal, and anyone who mattered understood the timeline before Arkvale could rewrite it. Because if they won the narrative, they could erase me twice, once from payroll and once from the truth. By the next morning, the tone had changed. Not the quick sync tone, the formal tone, the kind that shows up when procurement stops smiling and legal starts writing incomplete sentences. At 8:12 a.m., Tri-State sent the notice. Subject line: Notice to cure. Key personnel. SEV1 breach. No threats. No drama. Just a clean list of facts, timestamps, and contract citations. They cited the key personnel clause. They cited the active SEV1 event. They cited my termination timestamp, 7:42 a.m., as proof that Arkvale removed the named lead during an outage. Then they dropped the line that makes every vendor go cold. Tri-State is exercising its right to pause payments pending cure and documented stabilization. In other words, the money stopped until Arkvale could prove they were back in control. And that was just the beginning. My phone started ringing again, except now it wasn't Greg. It was numbers with actual titles behind them. Arkvale's VP of delivery called first. I let it go to voicemail. Then legal called. I let it go to voicemail. Then HR called, 3 times in 10 minutes. Like repeated attempts could rewrite what they'd already sent me. I didn't answer any of it. I forwarded everything to my attorney and kept my hands off the steering wheel. Because at this point, if I said one wrong thing verbally, they could slice it up and use it like a weapon. At 9:03 a.m., my attorney emailed me a draft response to Arkvale and Tri-State. It was short, precise, and deadly boring, the best kind. It did 2 things: confirmed the termination and access removal timeline, stated I was not authorized to perform work without a written agreement defining scope, compensation, and liability coverage. No emotion, no accusations, just hard edges. We sent it. 10 minutes later, Arkvale changed tactics. I got an email from HR with a subject that made my skin crawl. Job abandonment, documentation request. They were trying to use the oldest corporate trick in the book. If they could mark me as job abandonment, they could claim I voluntarily walked away from a live obligation which conveniently aligned with the story they needed Tri-State to believe. The problem was, it didn't match their own paper. They'd terminated me effective immediately. They'd cut my access. You can't abandon a job you've already been removed from? Not legally. Not logically. Not in any universe where timestamps exist. I didn't respond directly. My attorney did. He attached the termination email again like he was pinning a butterfly to a board, and wrote one line. Please clarify how an employee terminated at 7:42 a.m. can abandon employment after termination. Any further mischaracterization will be documented. After that, the job abandonment noise stopped. Not because they suddenly became honest, because they realized someone outside the building was now watching the timeline. Around 11:20 a.m., Tri-State scheduled a governance call and invited Arkvale's executive team. They didn't invite me. They didn't need to. My name was already in the documents. Maya texted me from inside, fast and clipped. They're on a war room call. VP is sweating. They're asking who approved your termination. I didn't reply. Then another text. Tri-State won't approve any replacement. They want a transition plan and proof of redundancy. They're asking why there was no deputy. That part hit harder than the penalties. Because I'd asked for a deputy. I'd asked for redundancy. I'd warned them that a single-threaded contract was a liability. Arkvale ignored it because redundancy costs money, and risk is invisible until it isn't. At 1:47 p.m., legal emailed again, different tone now, careful, polished. Subject, temporary consulting proposal. They offered me a short-term independent contractor agreement to assist with transition and stabilization. No apology, but the numbers were finally there. 175 hour. Up to 10 hours. Subject to approval. It was laughable. They were offering me 10 hours of contractor time to cover a live contract with hospital systems, active penalties, and a governance crisis. It wasn't a real offer. It was a checkbox. A way to later say, we tried to engage him. I forwarded it to my attorney without comment. He replied to Arkvale Legal with 3 requirements, and he kept it clinical. Written scope, what systems, what responsibilities. Written authority, what access, what approvals. Written indemnity and insurance coverage, because without it, I'm personally exposed. And then he added the part that made Arkvale's entire plan collapse. A rate that matched reality. Not ego. Reality, because the work they wanted was not helpful advice. It was live operational ownership under legal scrutiny. By 4:30 p.m., their answer came back. They refused indemnity. They wanted me to join the bridge as a courtesy. In plain English, they wanted me to absorb risk so they could avoid admitting how exposed they were. That's when something inside me settled. They thought my sense of responsibility would override my self-preservation. It didn't. They thought I would be the same guy who always said yes. I wasn't. That night, I slept for the first time in 2 days, not because the situation was resolved, because I finally accepted the truth. Arkvale wasn't asking me to save the client. They were asking me to save them from consequences. The next morning, the consequences arrived. Maya called me, and her voice had that tight, careful energy people get when they've just watched someone powerful fall. They called in all hands for leadership, she said. It's bad. What do you mean? They're saying Tri-State paused payments. They're saying the board is involved, and she hesitated like she couldn't believe it herself. And Greg got walked out. I didn't celebrate. I just closed my eyes and exhaled, because it finally felt proportional, not dramatic, not poetic, just consequences matching behavior. And then Maya said the last thing, the thing that turned my stomach again. They're trying to undo it now. HR is asking if you'd consider reinstatement, like none of this happened. I stared at the wall for a long time. Reinstatement. As if you can erase a termination, erase the client thread, erase the cure notice, erase the attempt to label me abandonment, then put the same person back in the seat and pretend trust still exists. My attorney emailed me one sentence after I told him, reinstatement does not erase the timeline. And in that moment, I understood where this was headed. Arkvale could try to patch the optics. They could try to shuffle titles and write new decks and push new faces into calls. But Tri-State had already seen the fracture line. They had proof that Arkvale would cut the named responsible person during a live outage, then tried to rewrite it after the fact. They thought the story ended with my termination. It didn't, because the contract was still live. The penalties were still real, and the client had stopped treating Arkvale like a partner. They were treating them like a risk. 2 weeks after they terminated me, I drove past Arkvale's building on purpose. Not to be dramatic. Not to show them. I just needed to see it with my own eyes. To confirm that the place I'd spent years of my life in was still standing, still lit up, still pretending nothing had happened. Because my life didn't feel like that. My life felt like someone had hit delete on a Tuesday morning, then tried to hit undo when they realized the client could see the screen. By then, the SEV-1 had been stabilized, barely. Arkvale's engineers did what engineers always do. They suffered quietly and fixed what leadership refused to fund properly. But the penalties didn't vanish when the dashboard turned green. Tri-State's cure notice stayed active. Payments stayed paused. And the governance thread, the one with my termination timestamp pinned to the top like a nail, never went away. It just grew. The turning point wasn't a screaming match. It wasn't a viral moment. It was a meeting, a formal governance call with Tri-State's procurement lead, their risk officer, and a counsel who spoke like every word was being saved to a folder. Arkvale sent 2 VPs, legal and a new interim delivery lead I'd never heard of. Maya didn't tell me everything. She couldn't, but she told me enough. They asked one question over and over, she said. Same question, different ways. What question? Maya paused. Who approved terminating the named key personnel during an active SEV-1? Arkvale tried the usual corporate fog. They said miscommunication. They said process gap. They said we value the partnership. They said we've taken corrective actions. Tri-State didn't move, because Tri-State wasn't angry in an emotional way. They were angry in a risk way, and risk people don't care about apologies. They care about controls. Then Tri-State did something Arkvale didn't expect. They asked for the paper, not decks, not lessons learned. Paper. They requested the termination approval chain, the access revocation log, the incident timeline, the escalation policy showing how key personnel decisions are handled, the staffing plan showing redundancy, including who was trained to cover my role. Arkvale couldn't produce half of it cleanly, because a lot of corporate process is just language, and language collapses when someone asks for the proof. That was when Tri-State played the card I didn't know they had been holding. They didn't terminate the contract immediately. They did something worse. They amended it. They issued a formal change order that reduced scope and moved critical services to a parallel vendor to mitigate operational concentration risk. It was the cleanest corporate way of saying, "We don't trust you anymore." The number Maya told me later sounded unreal. Tri-State shifted approximately $6.2 million of the remaining work into a competitor's hands over the next 12 months. Arkvale didn't just lose money. They lost face. Because big clients talk. Procurement networks are small. Risk officers share notes like it's their job, because it is. Arkvale's leadership reacted the way leadership does, when consequences finally have a dollar sign. They searched for a person to place it on. Greg was already gone. HR was already backpedaling. But the internal story still needed a headline. So they tried one more time to pull me back into the building and stitch the wound shut with my body. I got the email on a Thursday afternoon. Subject line: offer to resolve and reinstate. They offered reinstatement with back pay, a revised title, and a retention bonus. They even included the amount like it was supposed to quiet something inside me. $25,000 if I returned and helped complete the transition, a retention bonus, for a role they'd terminated effective immediately, for a contract they'd mismanaged into a cure notice, for a client relationship they'd fractured in writing. It wasn't a good faith offer. It was a containment strategy. My attorney read it and said, "They want to put you back on payroll so they can argue you were never removed as key personnel." And that's when I understood why the reinstatement mattered so much to them. It wasn't about me. It was about the contract record. If they could claim I was back, even briefly, they could tell Tri-State, "See? Continuity restored. Risk mitigated." Even if it was a lie, even if I had no trust left, even if the only reason they wanted me back was to use my name like a bandage. I didn't say no right away. I asked for one thing, not money, not title. One thing that told me whether they had changed at all. I replied, through counsel, with a single condition: a written admission correcting the job abandonment narrative, and a written acknowledgement that I was terminated during an active SFE1, with key personnel obligations still in force. Because if they were willing to tell the truth on paper, maybe there was a path forward. Arkvale's legal responded the next day. They refused. They wouldn't correct the narrative. They wouldn't acknowledge the timeline. They wanted me back without admitting what they'd done. They wanted the benefit of my name without paying the price of honesty. That was my answer. Not because I was bitter, because I finally saw the shape of the system I'd been working inside. I declined, cleanly, quietly, in writing. And then I did the thing that actually ended the story, the thing that gave me peace. I stopped trying to survive Arkvale's version of reality. I built a new one. A week later, Tri-State's governance lead emailed me directly again. Not to ask for help, to ask something else. A question that made me sit up. "Are you under any active non-solicit restrictions?" I forwarded it to my attorney. He reviewed my agreement and replied with the truth. There was a non-solicit clause, but it had specific limitations and a defined window. And Tri-State could request a waiver from Arkvale as part of their transition, something companies sometimes grant when they're trying to keep a client from burning them publicly. Tri-State requested it. Arkvale resisted at first. Then, after a second scope reduction and another governance escalation, Arkvale waived it quietly, because at that point, they were trying to keep Tri-State from taking the remaining contract entirely. And if giving up one former employee reduced the heat, they'd do it. Tri-State offered me a role, not as a hero, not as a savior, as what I'd always been, someone who understands the operational reality and respects the paper that governs it. The offer wasn't outrageous, but it was solid. $162,000 base, plus bonus, plus a title that actually matched what I did. Service Continuity Manager. I accepted. Not out of revenge, out of relief. Because the first time in a long time, I wasn't being asked to carry risk for people who refused to name it. I was being asked to manage it like an adult. The last time I heard about Arkvale was through Maya, months later. She called me on her lunch break and said, "You're not going to believe this." "What?" "They've changed the entire termination process for key personnel roles. Legal sign-off required. Client notification required. Access changes now staggered for operational continuity." I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. "So it took this," I said. "Yeah," she said. "It took you." After we hung up, I opened the old folder on my laptop, the one with the screenshots, the emails, the cure notice, the timeline. I didn't delete it. I didn't need to. Because the point wasn't to keep a weapon. The point was to remember the lesson. They terminated the only person responsible for a live contract and expected the contract to stay alive anyway. They tried to replace process with pressure. They tried to replace truth with narrative. They tried to replace accountability with a text message that said 10 mins. And what they learned, painfully expensively, was that responsibility isn't something you can demand after you revoke the badge. It's something you earn before you need it. I didn't sabotage them. I didn't leak anything. I didn't get revenge in the movie sense. I just stopped holding up a structure that was designed to collapse on top of me. And when I did, everything that was already broken finally became visible. That was the karma. Not fire, not chaos. Just consequences, arriving on time with timestamps.